Could negative rates end U.S. dollar reserve currency? I, boy, I don't think so because I mean, basically, what you're saying, I think what you're getting at, Don, is no one would buy treasuries because they're getting a negative yield. Therefore, um, there wouldn't be as much dollar demand, and that would kind of trigger this downward cycle. I just don't think so because I think so much of the dollar dependency, and most people don't really think this through, is a result of dollar denominated debt being created. Because when dollar denominated debt is created, it obviously creates demand for future dollars. Now, how many dollars is a different question because that has to do with velocity. You see, that's something that people don't think through much at all, is they think that if there's a loan that gets created for $1 million, well, that creates $1 million worth of future dollar demand. Not really, because $1 million loan can be paid off with $100,000. It's just you'd have to have a high rate of velocity. So you see what I'm saying there? It gets a bit, not just a bit, it gets extraordinarily complex. But I think if I'm a corporation and I'm getting paid to borrow dollars because there's a negative interest rate, I don't think that's going to deter me from buying or from borrowing dollars. I think I'm going to borrow more dollars than I otherwise would have, in which case that creates demand. Now, I understand how there's a lot of other factors at play here, but I think that's something that could kind of prop up the dollar from a standpoint of being used as a reserve currency status. Keep in mind, like 60% of all transactions globally are still done in dollars, although that percentage is declining. Also, one thing I'd point out is the dollar right now is at, let's say, 90, 192. And going even back to 2011 or so, it was down at like 70 on the DXY. So it can go down a lot. I mean, it could go down by 30%, and it's still on the DXY, and it still doesn't mean that it's in jeopardy of losing its reserve currency status. I really think the only thing that could really do that is something that happens slowly. It doesn't just the country say, oh, we're not using dollars anymore. I think it's more of they just gradually stop using them, and you get to this point where there's a lot of currencies that are being used just for, I don't know that there has to be a reserve currency. That's another thing. People always say, well, the dollar has to be the global reserve currency because there's nothing there to take its place. I don't know. Do we need a global reserve currency? Like, why? Can't Saudi Arabia sell their oil in rubles to some countries and in yuan to some countries and dollars? And yes, logistically, it gets a little complex. It's a lot smoother of a process if you've got one currency. But I don't know that if we don't have a global reserve currency, just the entire system just comes crashing down, and it's just impossible to have that. I don't know. I think it's just kind of a gradual dollar losing its status, if you will, because other currencies are being used in place of the dollar. And it just happens slowly over time. And the next thing you know, there's just all of these currencies that are being used at the same rate as the dollar. And then maybe it just the percentages just keep changing till we get to a point in 20 years from now where there's a currency that has taken over. And now, even though the dollar is being used for, let's say, 30% of global transactions, maybe there's a currency that in 20 years is being used at 35%. And now, all of a sudden, that's the majority of transactions because there's so many currencies that are being used. And there you go. But again, a lot of that has to do with debt. And the infrastructure isn't really there for to use a lot of other currencies for borrowing and doing transactions. And then you have the petrodollar. That's another thing that you got to think through. So, yeah, I think my end answer there is going to be the dollar losing its reserve currency status is, I don't think that happens due to negative interest rates. And if it does happen, I think it happens slowly, and it just happens over the course of 10, 15 years.